I think we'll be getting ready to start. Thank you all for coming. We appreciate you coming. We're super excited. Welcome to Zillow. My name is Nate Mock. I'm Vice President of Product Teams at Zillow. We're really excited to have you here. This is the second Products Account talk that we've had. So we're just kicking this off in Seattle. We're really excited about it. It continues to grow, I guess, each time, and we're going to be doing this monthly, every month. It's the second Wednesday of the month. Is that right? What day is it today? So yeah, thanks for coming. We want to kind of create this community and have people have a chance to talk and meet other people in the space. We're also hiring, so if you like what you see around here and are interested in jobs at Zillow, or we have recruiters over here too, behind the wine bar, so grab some wine and then you can talk to them. So thank you again for coming. Here's Annie.
I met a lot of you on your way in, so I'm the Seattle head of chapter here. So really excited that you're here. Products Accounts is something that's been around for a couple of years, and I've always enjoyed going to the events in San Francisco. So I was super excited when I heard that they were going to launch a chapter here in Seattle, because it's convenient since I live here, but so I think it's nice to Seattle to have something like this. So Products Accounts is one of the largest communities of product managers in the world, and we have chapters in San Francisco, Silicon Valley, London, New York, then Seattle, and then we'll be moving to LA and Boston. So thank you very much to Zillow for this incredible facility, and thanks for the introduction. We also have two other sponsors, Amplitude and mParticle, so we're very appreciative of them as well. And then we're really excited to have Ziad here tonight, the CPO of Convoy, and I'll just give you a bit of introduction for him. He's responsible for the data science and growth and product teams at Convoy, and prior to that was the CPO at Marchex, and then CEO of CityKey, and then also spent a brief stint in the Arctic, and maybe you can ask him about that after the event, but I'll let you take it away. But thank you very much for being here, all of you.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks everyone for coming, and thanks to Zillow for hosting us. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the math of product development. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how we've set up product at Convoy. We've made some, I think, unorthodox decisions on how we run our teams. Hopefully some of the things we've done are going to be surprising, but also enlightening. Let me start by telling you a little bit about my background. So I grew up in Sweden. I grew up in Stockholm. My parents moved there from Iraq, and I was born in Sweden. Very early on, I was kind of fascinated by computers. I don't know if any of you guys recognize that computer on the top left. You guys probably aren't using one of those. It's a Commodore 64. That was the first computer I had. And very early on, I started just experimenting, writing things on the screen, having it print out my name, then start creating small games. It was mainly a toy. I never thought it would be something I'd be working on for the long term. The first thing that changed my mind was when I was in high school. That was the first time that I realized that you can actually build a business around this thing. And so the school had an issue with scheduling, having parents meet the teachers. It was just a total mess, and everybody complained about it. And a friend and I went to the principal and said, like, hey, we think we can build you something. And so we built a piece of software. I wrote the underlying algorithms, and my friend wrote the user interface. And we sold it to our school, kind of school we went to, and then we sold it to a couple of other schools. And that was kind of my first experience where rather than delivering mail or working at the post office, I could actually do something that I found both super fascinating, and it was also, you got a much bigger multiplier on your work. You can kind of do it once and then sell to everyone. So I ended up going to the primary university in Stockholm for computer science, which is KTH. And kind of halfway through that program, I did my military service. So I went up for 2 years to the Arctic in Sweden. It was super fascinating. It was one of the best experiences of my life. There's an expression in Swedish, which is, there is no bad weather. There's only bad clothing. So it turns out that's not true, as I found out. So one of the things we did was you'd wear like 3 layers of long johns. It's actually something you did, and you'd still freeze. It would be like negative 40 Celsius. So I spent 2 years up there. It was really, really fascinating. I realized that I really wanted to get back to kind of building a company again. And so when I graduated, I started a company called CityKey with some of my friends. CityKey was essentially, you can think of it as Yelp, but probably 10 years too early. So the customers, kind of the early users who downloaded our app, used it on Palm Pilots and kind of the pre-iPhone smartphones, they really loved what we were doing, but there just weren't enough of them. And so that was probably the first setback in my career. This is when kind of the dot-com companies crashed, and I moved out from the apartment with my girlfriend, moved back to my parents. I'm like, oh, God, this is really, really not good. And I thought about what to do next. And so I had an opportunity to go to Harvard Business School and take 2 years and really reflect on how I built the company and what I could do better. And so I took that path. I wanted to spend a couple years working in like American tech companies, because in Sweden, we didn't have that many great tech companies at the time. Subsequently, you have Skype and Spotify and a couple others that have come out, but really the US is famous for its tech companies. And so Microsoft offered me a role. I spent a couple of years at Microsoft. I was trying to do basically things that really kind of pushed me and challenged me. I was interested in how Microsoft built software at scale. One of the most fun roles I had was actually an Internet Explorer team. Like, if you're going to do marketing, I'd say it's very, very interesting to do marketing for a product that everyone universally hates. The Internet Explorer marketing team was an incredible team of talent. And I remember when I joined, I changed my Twitter profile, and like the hate tweets started streaming in. So that was an incredible experience. At some point, I want to get back to doing kind of earlier stage companies. Marchex is a Seattle company focused on analytics. Spent a couple years there as the chief product officer, and I got to build a team from really thinking about all the principles and everything I'd learned and try to build an incredible team. It's probably what I was most proud of. Of my directs, 5 of my directs have subsequently gone on to be chief product officers or chief technology officers at other companies. It's an incredibly talented team. Dan, who's the founder of Convoy, I tried to recruit him actually to Marchex. He started Convoy, and he was telling me about what was happening at Convoy, and at some point, it was just too compelling not to join. It basically came down to, like, one, the market size was incredible. It's like $1 trillion market size. The growth of the company was unbelievable. And I had an opportunity to kind of build a team from scratch and all the things I'd learned. And so about 1.5 years ago, I jumped on that opportunity, and I've been with Convoy since. This is one of the most influential books. It's really kind of shaped how I think about product management and how to run product teams. It's a book called The Mythical Man Month. It's written by Frederick Brooks, and it's about his time at IBM, where he developed an operating system called OS 360. So it's a long time ago, but the rules still apply, and there are many mistakes that are still being made that are non-obvious that product and engineering organizations make. And so this has always stuck with me, which was the things that were obvious to me as an individual contributor, as an individual engineer. It turns out that when you run a team, there are just different rules for how things operate. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about that. And I'm going to walk through specifically some of the big ideas that I've thought about as it relates to how to develop products and what's changed since these books have been published. So the starting point that I use to think about how to develop products is really like, what is it we're trying to accomplish? And every product team is trying to have an impact. It starts, of course, with having a vision, trying to figure out where you're going to go, then defining the metrics. But then it's about making as much progress as possible against those metrics. And so you can sometimes see some product teams are very, very effective, and then you have equivalent product teams, similar levels of talent, but they aren't able to get the same output. I think about Amazon as an example of a large company, and there are other large companies, but I think Amazon innovates better and have had more innovations in the past decade than companies with similar size engineer and product teams. And so you start thinking about, okay, so what is it that makes things different? And I think it comes down to the product culture. The product culture are, what are the rules for how you operate? And you might think back to some of the experiences you've had at working in teams where it's sometimes like, you know, this is the right thing, but it's so hard to get things done inside the product culture. So it's really the combination of these two things, like having amazing ideas and then creating the environment where the best ideas come forward. So let me talk about a couple of the big, the slides seem a little bit misaligned.
We do.
Yeah, I don't know if it's possible to adjust them. But one of the big concepts that's emerged recently is about evaluating experiments. And this is really the shift from kind of packaged software or enterprise software to software that's on the web, where you can get continuous data about what you've shipped and you can learn very quickly. And so this is a very standard approach that I'm sure you guys have heard, which is, you know, we've trained our product team as scientists. We think about peer review. We think about p-values. We think about significance. This is a very common approach. This approach comes from scientific literature. It comes from things like the New England Journal of Medicine. You're publishing a paper. You want to make sure it's correct. You're putting your name behind it. Occasionally you read where there's scandals, somebody has published a paper and then it turns out something's wrong and they have to retract it, and it's very, very embarrassing. A lot of the product culture around experimentation has originated from these kind of scientific journals. And it's not surprising because some of the best talent around data science has come from academic backgrounds. But the question is that really the right model for us to emulate? So let me ask some questions here. I don't know if any of you guys gamble. But so here's a bet. Like let's say I roll a dice, and if it's a 1, 2, or 3, I'll give you $1 million. But if it's a 4, 5, or 6, then you have to pay me $1 million. Like, would you take that bet? It's pretty fair, right? Any takers? Okay, most people would say no. This is called loss aversion. People value what they have more than the potential upside. It turns out that in rare cases where there is some mutation to the amygdala in the brain, people lack the capacity of making these judgments, but I can tell you guys are not mutated in that way. So here's an even better bet, which is if it's a 1, 2, 3, or 4, I'll give you $1 million. But if it's a 5 or 6, then you have to pay me $1 million. Those are pretty good odds, right? Like, would anyone take those? Okay, 1 or 2 takers.
I guess if they're bankruptcy.
Okay, that's great. and if you have a spouse, you might say like, hey, there's this crazy guy. I'm going to roll the dice. I can come home with an extra $1 million, or, you know, we might have to sell the cars and take the kids, you know, and move somewhere else. But, you know, I got pretty good odds. There's 2 to 1 odds here that I'm going to win. So this really comes down to kind of the risk of ruin, right? Even though the odds are good, there's a 1/3 chance that it's going to cost you $1 million. And depending on your financial situation, like $1 million still hurts. It may hurt a lot. And so here's kind of the third experiment, which is you can do 100 rolls of a dice. The odds are the same as the last one. If it's 1, 2, 3, or 4, you win 10,000. But if it's 5 or 6, you've got to pay me. Like, would anyone take this one? Okay, most people take it. So that's actually you guys have the correct view on how to do this. The risk of losing money on this is 0.02%. So 99.98% of the time, you're going to make money. So now you think back to experimentation. You think back to product development. How does this relate? I think it's jumping like 90% of a slide, yeah. Unfortunately. So if you think about so if you think about these 2 experiments, the last 2, what's the difference between them? The first one, you're really running very few experiments, right? There's only 1 roll. And the cost of being wrong is extremely high. This is very similar to, like, if you think about scientific journals, it's very similar to scientific journals. You're publishing maybe 1 paper a year, 2 papers a year. And there's a huge reputational risk of being wrong. This situation where you have hundreds of rolls, for any individual, experiment, the impact of being wrong is probably quite low, and you want to control for that. You want to measure that. But if you can control for that, this is a different circumstance. So you think about what the correct strategy is for each one. So if you're publishing a scientific journal, your objective function is to limit mistakes because it's very embarrassing. It can ruin your career. Your peers are going to laugh at you. The correct strategy is make sure you've got high confidence. Now, there are all kinds of issues with people still manipulating the results and p-hacking and other things. That's a separate set of concerns. This is the correct strategy. In this case, you should have a different strategy. It's about maximizing your impact. That's your objective function. You're a product manager, you're an entrepreneur, you're running your company. What you're trying to do is get an edge over the competition. What you're trying to do is solve the problem faster for your company. It doesn't matter if you make a small mistake. If on average you are better off, that you're doing right by your customers. And so the goal here is you should accept whenever you have an edge. And so this is the basic concept, which is you're trying to maximize your impact over time. You're going to have more false positives with a low confidence strategy, but you're also going to have many more winners with a low confidence strategy. With a high confidence strategy, you're going to have more false negatives. You're going to reject things that were actually good experiments. And so we ran this as a simulation with actual data for Convoy. And this is the data for our business. The thing, though, is you need to think about each business is going to be different. So you need to think about the specifics about your business, what kind of experiments you're running, what kind of audience size you run, and the way you make decisions in a small company or a new product might be very different than how you'd run it in a product with many, many more users. Well, the fundamental concept is the same, which is the thing you should really be optimizing for is the average impact rather than trying to be worried about, am I making a specific mistake on this one experiment? The other part, so I've talked about the benefits of experiments or the benefits of feature. The other part is evaluating costs. And so this is a quote that I hear quite often, which is the effect is small. We've run the experiment. The effect is quite small, but we should still ship it because our customers told us when we interviewed them that they want this thing, and we've already built this, right? And so this is actually a classic example of the sunk cost fallacy. But there's another problem with it. The sunk cost fallacy isn't the biggest problem with product development. It's the opposite. What I think of as the unsunk cost fallacy. This is when people ignore the future costs, right? They assume that, hey, I built this thing. Now I'm ready to ship it. Why shouldn't I ship it? I've done all the work. Well, the reality is the work doesn't stop there. Like you notice this in engineering teams, which is engineering teams slow down. When you first start a company, you can ship things very, very quickly. And all of a sudden it's like, well, we had these outages, we have this technical debt, it's now more complex to factor in this new system. That's what happens, right? And so this is the future cost. But the future cost isn't evenly distributed. Some features have zero future costs. So for example, if you're changing the color of your website from blue to red, and hypothetically, that gives you some kind of lift or some kind of expected lift, there's no maintenance cost to that. There's a hexadecimal code that you're changing on your website, and that's it. On the other hand, if you're building a new interaction, a fundamentally new way for people to interact with your website, and it has a small lift, they need to think about all the subsequent things I'm going to do on that page. You need to think of how does it fit into this interaction model? And there's a design tax, there's a product management tax, there's an engineering tax. They're probably going to have more outages. Right, and all these things factor in. So you need to now trade off this benefit versus this cost. And so this is actually what happens, which is you think you're on this curve, you think you're making all these great decisions, but what you're doing is you're incurring this technical debt, and this is what's accumulating over time. Is you need to be very selective. And the thing is that to make these decisions, and this is kind of where it gets really challenging. To make these decisions, you notice that it's no longer a product decision. It's no longer a data science decision. It's no longer an engineering decision. It's actually these three teams working together to figure out what the right answer is. And in some organizations, these teams are more siloed, and they're optimizing for slightly different things. Like maybe your data science team is optimizing for, we want to publish great results, and we want to know we're correct. And your engineering team might not be involved in the decision of which features to take and which features not to take, right? But you want these three stakeholders talking about it together. And so the way we approach this at Convoy is we bring these things together. So we talk about the expected impact. What do we think is going to happen if we ship this? we want to minimize the risk because we want to avoid that scenario where we ship something and then we have this high risk of ruin. So we look at the experiments and say, if we're wrong, how wrong can we be? And then we want to think about the future effort, because the future effort is going to cause us to take certain experiments, but if they're expensive, we might reject them. So there's some circumstances where you run experiments by traditional metrics, you have a very low p-value, but we would reject them. And we would reject them either because the cost is really high, combined with maybe the effect isn't that big, because the p-value doesn't tell you anything about the effect size, and it doesn't tell you anything about the engineering cost. And so to make great decisions, you need to combine these three things into your decision-making. And so then the final piece is like technical debt management. So technical debt management is usually something that's handled by the engineering team. It's again not this combined decision, but technical debt management should really be reversal of that graph. And so what happens with technical debt management is it tends to be underinvested because it's hard to quantify. And when people do technical debt management, it might be misdirected. They might go after certain areas that they find problematic, but it's actually not the thing that's going to give you the biggest bang for the buck. So you want to use the same framework, but in this case, you should have data. You should be collecting data about your systems. You should be collecting data about your incidents. So as you're doing this, you should say, look, these things that I can go after are going to have the 10x multiplier on my productivity, as opposed to these other things. And you should bend this curve, right? You should, instead of going like this, your team should now have much higher throughput. So these are the things that we try to practice at Convoy in how we run our kind of product teams, our data science teams, our engineering teams, our design team. We kind of bring them together and try to make these decisions in a smarter way and kind of in faster ways. Okay, so let me summarize. The first one is, you can be individually an incredible product manager, data scientist, designer, engineer, but the impact of what you do is really defined also by the system that you live in. And we spend a lot of time thinking about how we should build our features, but we should spend an equal amount of time thinking about what is the system and how do we iterate on it. So I think of this as like there are really two products you're building. So the first product is the thing you ship to customers. The second product is the thing you're managing inside your company, right? The product system, the product culture that lets you operate. And as you get more senior, and as you start managing teams or as you start running a function, then your efforts start shifting more towards product 2 and away from product 1. So one of the big things that when I talk to other chief product officers and they ask me, okay, what's going to be different? It's like, well, you're going to start shifting away from actually managing the product. Now you should be thinking about how are you building the culture of your team and how do you know it's actually working for you? The third one is don't copy other companies. It's equally bad to copy the New England Journal of Medicine and say, like, we should just do what they did because they're a very well-renowned periodical, and they probably have great practices. Product development is different, and it's also different for different companies. And so you need to figure out what are the circumstances of your company that's going to help you get the fastest growth and edge as a business. And the final thing is, just the way we've all learned to instrument our product that we ship to our customers, you should build that same instrumentation into the second product, the internal culture and the internal systems and how you run your product so you can operate more effectively. Okay, that's what I had. Thank you. So I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Yeah, we'll take about 10 minutes for Q&A.
Yes.
You talked about tech debt and the importance of making sure you're taking what's impact of tech debt. Can you talk about how you guys do that?
Yeah. So at Convoy, I'd say we have relatively minimal tech debt because we're a relatively new company. The best example is probably from Marchex, my last company. That was a company that had been around for a while. It had sprawled a lot to encompass lots of different products. And so we had debt in a couple different ways. First, we had debt just in certain products that shouldn't be in our portfolio. So that was kind of the first conversation we had, like what should be in our portfolio, because it's really expensive to maintain kind of separate products. So we cut down our product portfolio when I joined from about 10 products down to 2. That helped a lot. But then within the 2 products, we wanted to have leadership. But as it happens, Marchex is in the business of routing calls. And the most important thing when you're providing analytics on top of phone calls is that the calls actually go through, as it turns out. Because nobody's interested in your amazing dashboards when your calls don't go through. And it also turns out that it is highly noticeable when your systems are down, because then your large enterprise customers, call centers, are all of a sudden completely quiet. And even if they're completely quiet for 5 minutes where nobody's on the phone and everybody's looking around, you start getting emails. So the way we approached it was we kind of looked at the architecture of our system, and we said the function we're going to optimize for, which is slightly different than the one I specified here. This one is about maximizing a kind of throughput of the team. The one we chose to optimize for was least dropped calls. And so we looked at our architecture and figured out which points have failed the most over the past year. So we had built that instrumentation. And then we figured out what's the cost going to be to re-architect this. So in some cases, it was pretty expensive, like we went from single data center to geo-redundancy. In other cases, it was about, just breaking out certain modules. So if the analytics part went down, it didn't take down the call routing. But I think it fundamentally comes down to like being clear on what function you were optimizing for, making sure you have the instrumentation, and then our product engineering team, we sat together and we made these decisions together, and then we just drove it down. Yeah.
Do you guys? Oh, thanks. You talked about when you are determining whether to launch a product or a feature or not, you look at the potential risk and also the potential future cost. Do you try to quantify that all, or is that more of a qualitative discussion?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So we try to quantify each one of those. Some are harder to quantify than others. So to quantify risk, we use a loss function, which essentially probability weights certain outcomes. And so we use that, and there's a minimum threshold that we are willing to tolerate before we consider an experiment. Because if we are wrong, like if you think about the experiment with rolling a dice, if you're wrong, you want to avoid catastrophic results. So there's a minimum threshold that we've defined before we consider experiments. And that's computed programmatically by our platform, and we have a dashboard, and we can see every experiment. In terms of engineering costs, it's slightly more complex. So we had an experiment that we talked about today. The way it was characterized, if I remember correctly, was it's about 600 lines of code. It's in a separate module that's not going to interface with other parts of the product, and we think it's going to be relatively easy to maintain, right? And so that's not a precise number, but it gives you some sense of how complex is this compared to other features that we've built, and then you kind of look at all those 3 things together. And then you say, okay, well, what is the right decision for Convoy? And I would say, given our framework, we probably pull the trigger a lot more than other companies on things that have, where we have like a 2/3 chance of being right, as opposed to having a 19 out of 20 chance of being right, right? So we're willing to pull the trigger a lot sooner, which I think is the right thing for us to do as a company. And I think it's actually helped us kind of innovate and grow faster.
Okay. Yeah.
So it sounds like Convoy is farther along in the product market fit journey. How would you adapt your approach? Would you, for products at like an earlier stage of product market fit, could you walk through like a use case of your experimentation, like with the project?
Yeah, so I think it is very kind of company specific, and I think it's especially challenging, like when you're either building a new company or if you're launching a new product within an existing company. And the reason for that is you're probably not going to have as much data. So even at Google, there are probably new products that are being developed or new features that are being developed that don't have enough users on them. And so that's where I think this approach ends up being a lot more powerful, because if you've ever worked in places where your experiment looks really promising, but you aren't able to get power in your experiment, you might be missing out on those innovation. And as a startup, especially at the startup phase, being able to get those wins can be the difference between getting traction as a company or not. And so you probably have some benefits, which is you're probably going to have bigger effect sizes initially. So the effect sizes at a large company might be some fractional percent. You're probably going to have bigger effect sizes, but you're going to suffer from having much fewer users in your product. And so you're going to need to use something like this, a more balanced approach where we look at kind of the risk of taking this bet as opposed to waiting until later and burning through more of your startup capital. Yeah.
So I appreciate how you broke out the product one part to like what the actual consumer gets the most types of products that you build. But the other side of this product too, which is how you build a team and how you grow that team. You talked a little bit about how you've taken a team and grown them into future CPOs and product people. I'm wondering what kind of mechanisms you put in place and frameworks you built in place to help grow those teams and be able to let go and trust that what you're building is going to continue to be something.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So I would say Convoy is very different than Marchex. Both are kind of great companies in their own way, but Convoy has a very different brand than Marchex. And so learning that at Marchex, like how do you attract people to a company that may not have the kind of halo effect of like a Zillow or a Convoy or kind of brands that you recognize? I think what it comes down to is what I found is that great people, great product managers, great engineers, they want to have an impact. And the thing you can usually offer them at an earlier stage is you can offer people to have a greater kind of percentage impact on the business. It comes down a little bit also to persistence. Like even the best people at the best companies, they get frustrated at certain times. And so if you know those people that are really, really good, like, I knew Dan. Now the reverse happened, which is I tried to poach him and it didn't work. But if, I stayed in touch with him. We talked regularly. That's how I got some of the very best people. And then I think it comes down to like the product culture, like how you set up the organization. One of the things I sold some of the best people on is, we're organized here into small self-contained teams. If you stay at Amazon, Google, Facebook, etc., you're going to be in your function. It's hard for you really to be a GM where you're kind of looking across the business, looking across product engineering, design, data science, and really collaborating and making decisions. You come in here, you can go do that. Those are the things I use to try to convince amazing people to come work for us. And at Marchex, at Convoy, we similarly been fortunate. We've had some incredible people come join us. And it comes down to the same thing. I think a lot of people just want that impact. Yeah.
So at Convoy, you've been pulling the trigger on things, that have a 2/3 chance of working out. I'm hearing that some of them don't. What's your, is there a soundbite worthy, example of something that didn't go as well as you'd hoped? And, why did it get greenlit? And what did you do when you realized it wasn't working?
Yeah, there are things that outright fail. So there are lots of ideas we've had that we thought were brilliant ideas that outright failed. So this isn't saying, take everything. But there are things that we have shipped where we weren't completely confident. Those are kind of great candidates for what's known as replication testing. Those are done now in scientific journals as well, where somebody finds a very interesting result, and then you want to replicate it later on to make sure, is that really a valid result? And so, one way to think about that is some of these things are a little bit more risky. When you have more data, you can come back to them and you can retest and go do it again. And so I would say we haven't yet found something where we've had the opportunity to come back and do replication testing, but it's one thing we're thinking about. Yes.
This is kind of like a more philosophical question, but earlier you were talking about measuring impact of experiments, and the stance is kind of taken from us as a company, we're measuring the impact on us as an organization and on the product. But experimentation and products also have an effect on users. You're kind of voluntary to introduce kind of paying for them, so it gets some learning. And in the scientific community, there's standards of ethics that are taught through school, and even in the financial services industry, there's like fiduciary responsibility, kind of in the same field. I guess, how do you think about like ethics of testing and think about like there's really no standard in technology given how much it's experiments on users? Like, how do you feel like, or how do you approach that I don't know.
That's a great question. I think it depends on kind of what your objective function is. So we generally think that the improvements we're making to the product, like our philosophy is the way our company is going to succeed is we've got to get truck drivers to love Convoy, and we've got to get shippers to love the experience with us. So a lot of the things we do really come down to, if we run this experiment, will truck drivers end up spending more time with us and taking more work with Convoy? So one thing we recently released was something called automated detention. So automated detention, it turns out that if you're a truck driver, it can be a very, very painful experience because you sign up for a job and you're driving, and that's really hard, and we all kind of sit in offices and we don't think about how hard that is. Now you arrive at your job and they may not be ready to load your truck. In fact, you may end up waiting for 8 hours. So that really, really sucks. But now to make it even worse, for you to get paid that 8 hours, there are all kinds of strange hoops to jump through, and every shipper has different rules. At some point, you're just like, it's not even worth the effort, right? So one of the features we built was something called automated detention. Automated detention says, since you're using our app, we have your GPS info. We know when you arrive, and we know when the shipment is supposed to load. And so if it's taking too much time, we can just automatically pay you. You don't need to go through any of the paperwork. And we're going to standardize all the upstream complexity, right? And so most of our features are in that spirit, where we're trying to solve kind of big pain points for our customers. I haven't come across anything yet where I feel like we're doing something that might be not right for our users. We're not doing right by our users. I would say, having worked previously in ad tech, and clearly there's a bunch of debate right now around Facebook. I think there are kind of harder conversations that in things like ad tech, I think gaming and kind of the addictiveness of gaming and kind of microtransactions, like that's another one where I think that there's ethical questions. I specifically chose to work at a company where I felt like if I solve this problem, then I will feel really good about solving these problems coming home, as opposed to if I solve these problems, yeah, we'll make a bunch of money, but I'm going to feel really bad about what I'm doing in this world. And so I think it partially comes down to like aligning what's important to you ethically with the company you work for. And for me, I haven't come across anything at Convoy where I say like, wow, this seems objectionable. We're doing something for us that's going to hurt people.
I think that's great. I also think it's sometimes it's tough when it's like people at Facebook make technologies are like bad people.
I don't think so either.
Like they're best making technology, but it's almost like how do you build technology to protect people from themselves? Like think about Uber, it's like okay, yeah, they're paying these drivers and these people aren't even living. But at some point, they're also moving towards automation. So it's like all the data they're collecting on driving is then feeding to an algorithm that will eventually automate these people. The more they drive, the better the algorithms get, the better like the AI. So it's like I don't know. I don't think there's this question as an has an answer. I'm just curious about exploring it. Like,
I completely agree with you. I think that there's a little bit of, like for all of us, we kind of live inside the tech bubble. And I think there are many problems. This is actually something that I had to learn at Convoy, which is many times the standard response as a product manager is, if I can just write a slightly better algorithm, I can go solve this problem. If I can write a better machine learning algorithm, I can find all the bad articles and clean up the web and not have fake news. Like that is a general mindset I would say that we have as a kind of technology industry. I think the reality is that there are going to be a lot of really, really interesting problems to solve over the next decade that are going to be at this intersection of kind of humans working together with machine learning algorithms and software, and together you can solve problems more efficiently. And so some people call that kind of human in the loop learning, where you have kind of a human and then you have a bunch of technology. And so I think there's some really, really interesting problem. But yeah, many, like myself, I come from a software background. So my natural instinct is, hey, let me just think about what algorithm I can write that solves that. But there are a bunch of other patterns. I think some of those other patterns are very important to software development. Yes.
In your last slide, you talked about instrumenting your culture as well. Do you have any examples of that?
Yeah, by instrumenting our culture, I specifically think about like the systems that let you be productive. So it's things like gathering information about when you have outages, gathering information that can help you make future decisions about technical debt and where to go after it. It's things like understanding the magnitude of the effects that you're having in your experiments. That's going to help you shape the right way to design future decisions around experiments, right? All these things are really, really important data points, but if you don't collect them and if you don't collect them to feed into your system and you don't think about your future decisions, they're lost. And then you're making arbitrary decisions about how to make future decisions about experimentation or how to make decisions about technical debt or a whole host of other things that will affect your product organization.
Great. Any more questions?
Okay, thank you so much for your questions.
Thank you. I'm short, so thank you very much for to everyone for being here, and thank you very much for, that was really interesting, so I really enjoyed that. I hope all of you did as well. So we have a program, there's some more about Convoy. We'll go through. We have a program. Our next program is on May 9th, and we have Kintan Brahmat. He's the Director of Product Management and Engineering Program Management at Amazon Music, coming up from San Francisco. And he'll be talking about how you start with the customer and work backwards. And then I heard some conversation about design ethics. We'll have a conversation about design ethics on in the June event, and then some other interesting things coming up. So thank you very much for Zillow. I understand that we have a recruiting team in back. So there's another part of this segment for products that counts, and we ask people to come up and just share something. It's less about sales, but maybe if you're looking for a job, looking for a mentor, hiring, feel free to come up now. We have a few minutes if you'd just like to come and share with the group. And I have a products that counts notebook for anyone, for the first person who wants to do this. So I'll give you open mic, lightning talk. I'll give you a few minutes to do this, and then we'll break and we have a lot of pizza to eat. Thanks. Anybody? No one's looking for a job, and no one's hiring. I don't believe it. But here we go. And we can broaden that up as well. Great, thank you.
Hi, my name is Brahmi. I moved like a month ago from San Francisco to Seattle, so I'm fairly new. I'm understanding the city. But meanwhile, I've been attending all these meetups. I've attended a lot of product that counts in SF, and I'm so glad that it's here. It's been a great tool for me to network and meet very interesting people. I'm right now a product manager in a healthcare company, and I'm managing a data platform. I'm actually trying to look at ways to bring in more design thinking into how do I influence my teams, how do I influence my decisions, my co-product managers, etc. So if anybody of you are particularly using design thinking in a certain format that you think is very exciting, I'll be sitting there, or I'm just roaming around here. Feel free to just walk up to me. I would love to have a quick chat. Thank you.
My name is Jenny Zenner, and I'm with the University of Virginia Darden School of Business. I'm the tech sector manager on careers, and I just came back from a HR leaders and tech conference, and they were talking about how they're applying the mindset of product management to their workforce. So either the recruiting function or then upskilling your workforce and thinking of your workforce as a product. And in addition, I've got a lot of students in our MBA program who are coming to me and saying, I want to be a product manager in tech, and they don't have a CS degree. And so I'm going through this meta experience of how do I take our education, the product output of our students, to then turn them into product managers. So I welcome coffees, lunches, happy hours with anyone here in the room who wants to talk with me about how to build the next generation of product managers.
Anybody else this evening? Great. Well, thank you again for being here, and thank you again to Zillow. Any last words, Nate? Okay. Yep. We have the room until 8:30, so thank you very much.